Okay, looks like everyone has logged in, so let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Getting the Most Out of Microsoft Intune. First, some housekeeping notes before we get started. Everyone is on mute, so if you have questions, please enter them in the chat box, and we will try to get to them at the end of the webinar. The session is being recorded, so an email will be sent afterwards with the replay link and a copy of the slides. Today's presenter is mobility expert Patrick McGlynn. Patrick is a technical project manager here at BlueFletch and has been in technology for over a decade with companies such as Teradata and Coca-Cola. Welcome, Patrick.
Hello, everyone. Today's BlueFletch webinar will be around getting the most out of Intune. I'm your host, Patrick McGlynn, and I've been working with BlueFletch for over 7 years now, managing and configuring different MDMs and EMMs for Android management. Today's webinar will be mostly focused on the Android platform, but as some of you might know, Intune does support multiple platforms, including Windows, Mac, and iOS. First, let's talk about what is Intune and why people choose it. So Intune is Microsoft's unified endpoint manager solution that is cloud hosted. A lot of organizations are already running Microsoft Office 365 and have been looking at using Intune as a replacement for their current MDM or EMM offerings out there. Intune is actually a great option for those Microsoft Office 365 organizations. A few reasons for that. If you're already managing all your users in Azure AD and you have your group set up, well, that is nicely integrated with Intune and can be used to not only enroll devices, but also assign applications and build compliance policies. Secondly, if you are a Office 365 org, it does make the subscription and licensing a lot easier because you can just add that subscription to your user accounts and your billing is all handled the same. So, as I mentioned, Intune is part of Microsoft's Endpoint Manager, which is a true UEM in that it manages Windows, iOS, Mac, and Android devices. So we know a lot of companies that are looking to consolidate to fewer platforms and standardize their management practices across all their devices. So this fits in nicely with that policy. A lot of companies are already using Endpoint Manager for setting up their Windows laptops, using tools like Autopilot to provision those laptops, etc. Well, now your Android devices can also be brought under this same window and same portal. So I would recommend Intune for some of the more simple use cases. Microsoft Intune is Android Enterprise recommended, which means it does support all of the Android Enterprise features that are available. However, there isn't a lot of customization on top of that. It's what you would call a pure play type of EMM. So it's closely aligned with Android Enterprise APIs as far as how policies are set up and deployed to devices. Also, if you have a smaller deployment, I would say Intune can be a good solution for you. We can get into why I make that statement later, but for Android, some of the simpler use cases are perfectly fine for Intune. Since Intune does focus a lot on the other Windows platforms and iOS and Mac, Android has slowly been given more and more attention, but it's still not as full featured yet. So simple use cases are really a great fit out of the box for Intune. And also, IT budgets are pushing companies to look into investing in Intune. This is a much lower cost option when compared to some of the other big names on the market like Workspace ONE and SOTI. It's not completely free, as you may have heard. However, it is an extremely low cost option, especially when considering just dedicated devices. Interesting graph that I found around Gartner shows really the growth of Microsoft Intune really in just 1 year. If you see on the right, 2019, Microsoft was closely coupled with Workspace ONE. However, in 2020, you can see that they've really blown up in Gartner's eyes as far as being a leader and a visionary in the unified endpoint manager space. We know how Microsoft has nearly unlimited budget to go develop products and market it. So we see this trend continuing probably and has been continuing since these graphs were published. Let's talk about some of the shortcomings of Intune. We hear a lot of customers that are interested in Intune but aren't sure they're ready to take that leap because they've heard that, quote unquote, Intune is not ready for prime time. Well, that is true in some ways. Here are some of the shortcomings that I see, especially when looking at the Android platform. So the first is the big one, and this isn't unique to Intune. It's actually really an Android enterprise thing, is that the lack of file management. So UEMs and EMMs are trying to get away from being able to manipulate files on devices. They don't want you to push files locally. And the reason is they're trying to adopt the app config framework, which is going to push all your configuration files along with your applications to not require any provisioning or setup from users. However, this can be a problem for some use cases. I know some clients of ours like to push training PDF materials to devices rather than trying to host them in a cloud. They'd rather them just live locally on the device. Well, this is going to be an issue for you coming to Intune. The next one is remote control. So while Intune does offer a third-party extension with TeamViewer, it is additional licensing. And in the case of dedicated devices, you're actually going to spend a lot more on that remote control than you are for the actual management of the devices themselves in Intune. Device grouping is one of the other issues I kind of have with Intune. Coming from other EMMs and UEMs, you're going to be familiar with the concept of buckets or organization groups or device groups. Well, Intune doesn't really have that concept. They're trying to drive you to use Active Directory groups and leverage all your security groups and dynamic groups you might have there. The problem with this, though, is that it makes it a little bit harder to manage your portal and your environment, meaning that I'd have to provide access to a user. They would then have access to all of the quote-unquote buckets of devices. So they make it a little bit harder to create different sandboxes and isolated silos where you can have devices, have different permissions, and really have no ability to overlap with those other groups. Next is around reporting and analytics. So in my testing, I have seen really the biggest is that there's just a lack of good device data. And quick example you see on the screen here is the network details. I'm actually not getting even an IP address of my device. So there's just a lack of data coming off. And there's also seems to be quite a bit of latency in the reporting. When looking to see compliance for app installs or app configuration installs, I was waiting up to 10 minutes sometimes to check compliance. So definitely something I'd like to see improved in the future. Finally, it was around IoTs and wearables. It's just something that Microsoft hasn't spent a lot of time looking at yet. And there's just really a lack of support and management of those, especially for anything that's trying to run Unix or Linux, and printers or wearables that might be running those operating systems are going to have very, very limited, if any, support in Intune. So Intune is free. We hear that a lot. And first, that's not true. Second, there are also some quote unquote hidden costs that you're going to uncover if and when you make the switch to Intune. So the first, user-based licensing. So if you're using dedicated devices, it pretty much is free. You have to have at least one admin account, but then you can enroll as many of those dedicated devices you want and have no incremental charge for each device you enroll. However, if you're using a corporate-owned, personally enabled, or BYOD type of model, and you're enrolling those devices, you're going to be paying per user for those devices. And I'm not sure the exact cost. I think last time I checked, it was around $6 per user. So again, that's definitely not free, but it is a lower cost option when you look at the rest of the market. Some of the other hidden costs, one we talked about is the additional tooling, in that you actually need to purchase a separate remote control license to have that functionality. And any large organization I've been in relies pretty heavily on that remote control for all their support and troubleshooting remotely to make sure those devices are, up and operational. Analytics and troubleshooting, as I mentioned, definitely one of the shortcomings. So you're probably going to have to invest in some other type of tool like Splunk, Power BI, or a BlueFletch option that we have for pulling analytics off of devices and trying to get near real-time logs of what's happening on those devices for, your KPIs, for your business, for your ops teams, or even just your IT support team looking to troubleshoot a bug. Another tooling issue that we think, companies would probably be interested in supplementing would be for single sign-on. On these shared devices in Intune, there is a launcher that provides single sign-on, but only to teams at the moment. It's not full single sign-on with OAuth or OIDC protocol. So pretty limited features for that. Next up is access controls. I mentioned this previously in the shortcoming, but really hidden costs if someone makes a mistake. If you have access to Intune, you really have access to all the devices that are enrolled. So don't want to have any issues there, but definitely could see that becoming problematic. And finally, this one is less of a cost, more of just an observation and from reading online. A lot of people seem to dislike the portal in that it's a lot different than most other EMMs and not quite as usable. So while this is not a deal breaker by any means, there is a much bigger learning curve with this platform than others. And again, these are not things that are showstoppers, but just things to consider if you really are looking to make a switch to Intune as your EMM. So I want to talk about some of the tips and tricks I've picked up from playing around with Intune. The first is I would highly recommend looking at a third-party launcher. BlueFletch, of course, offers one here, but the ones from Microsoft are a bit limited. So Microsoft Launcher is more for your BYOD or corporate-owned, personally enabled devices. And this is really just a user set home screen where you can pick your favorite apps, pick your wallpaper. You can also sign on and have access to your Microsoft account. But that's limited for those two models. It's not for shared devices. Microsoft does offer the Manage Home screen for shared devices. And this is more like a lockdown screen that you see on the market from Workspace ONE and SOTI, and even from the OEMs. They have their own solutions here as well. But it is set up to only provide single sign-on to Teams at the moment, just because Microsoft hasn't added any other apps for the Microsoft authentication language support yet. And also it can only be tied to Azure Active Directory at this time. So it's pretty limited, as I mentioned previously, in its scope for single sign-on. So I would, again, look at a third-party launcher like BlueFletch Enterprise, which is MDM and OEM agnostic, as well as identity provider agnostic. So really a true solution that can be dropped in and help with your shared device models and facilitate your single sign-on properly. With enrollment, so yeah, as I mentioned, dedicated devices actually don't cost anything to enroll in and manage. So if you can get by with not having any user assignment of devices, if you're just using, purpose-built shared devices, kiosk mode devices, all-day dedicated devices is a great option for you for enrollment, and especially for your costs. Going to be really cheap there. This is the reason they're doing this is because it's leveraging Android Enterprise APIs, which are open source and available for everyone. So there's really no benefit or reason for them to charge for those dedicated devices, since they're not adding much value, them being Microsoft on top of that. My biggest tip and trick for Intune, and one of the key takeaways, is OEM config. So this, you can think of OEM config as like the ultimate Swiss Army knife for configuring your devices. A lot of the major players like Honeywell, Zebra, Nokia, Motorola all have OEM configs out there on the Play Store. And the great thing about OEM config is whenever a hardware manufacturer adds a new management feature to their device, it's instantly available from the Play Store to configure and set up that device with those settings. You're not having to wait for your MDM or EMM to adopt that UI or that functionality and build it in. So this is really, as I mentioned, the Swiss Army knife. Their OEMs build a lot of functionality that isn't possible with Android Enterprise, such as file moves, such as certificate installation, setting NTP servers, setting default home screens, et cetera, et cetera. There's really a ton of different features out there, and I highly encourage you to get more and more comfortable with OEM config, how that's set up and deployed. And if you are going to use Intune, this probably should be the first thing you go and evaluate. And then next up would be a file installer. So not every app is set up for the app config model right now, where the configuration gets deployed through the managed Google Play Store. We see a lot of legacy applications out there that just aren't being actively developed, but work just fine and require some type of external configuration. In this case, I would say, come check out BlueFletch. We do have a tool to download and manipulate files on devices. This, I don't believe, is functional for every OEM out there, but I can give you some more details on that if you reach out. But if you are looking to push files down to devices, if that's something as simple as icons or even certificate files or configuration files for applications, we can help you fill that gap on that. So really, those are my big tips and tricks for Intune if you are going to evaluate to see if this is a fit for your business. So I mentioned BlueFletch. How else can BlueFletch help you roll out Microsoft Intune? From a user experience perspective, I mentioned our launcher. It's just a lot easier to configure and much more feature robust than what Intune has out of the box. It's also a true SSO. We do support teams like Intune, but we also support other OIDC compliant apps, web apps, and even have some hooks for setting up our SDK to integrate with your third-party apps. So really a great user experience on the end user side. When they pick up the device, there's a launcher, the ability to sign on, and a customized experience for that user. Remote control is also included with our BlueFletch Enterprise. This, as I mentioned, TeamViewer is an option through Intune, but if you are looking at supplementing Intune with other tools, BlueFletch can provide you both that launcher, single sign-on, and remote control in the same license. We also include reporting tools. As I mentioned, one of the shortcomings of Intune was their lack of data points and the latency around that data. So our support application captures over 25 data points, as well as application usage reports. And then if you're using that in tandem with our launcher, you can see who's using the device and what applications that user is using it. So that builds a really good check-in, check-out story and accountability chain for each device. And we can provide all that data to you in a much more consumable format with near real-time results on that. Order processing is something we've also built to supplement Intune. So with the way things coming from the Play Store occur is you don't have a ton of control over setting dependencies in order for processing. If you want to, say, push down a configuration file, install an application, run an intent, and then reboot a device, well, you can't really set that in phases in Intune. That would be a much more manual process, and I know that sounds like kind of a complicated set of steps, but for you guys out there that are having to stage devices, that's probably something pretty common you come across. You need things to execute in an exact order to guarantee that the device is set up properly and compliant. So we have built our playbook installer to run things in a very serial process, and there's a lot of checkpoints along the way to ensure that devices are properly set up and staged. So we can, again, set that up, deploy it through Intune, but BlueFletch on the device will manage all that serial processing. Lastly is just leveraging our consulting for environment setup and configuration. If you're intimidated by Intune because it is this whole new portal and whole new system and really a whole new way of thinking for managing Android devices, definitely reach out. Happy to help, lend some guidance, lend some hours, whatever you need with your Intune setup, we can help. So some of the key takeaways from Intune. The first is OEM config. If someone had to ask me, would I recommend Intune to them? I think I would say yes, Intune is a viable option for managing your devices, with the caveat that you need OEM config to fill those gaps. If you did not have an OEM that provides that and provides robust functionality in their OEM config, I would say wait on Intune until that is available. You're just going to find too many gaps in what you're doing today with Intune unless you have that OEM config. And the next is also look at additional tooling besides just OEM config. Some of the things I called out that you might consider would be around single sign-on, reporting and analytics, remote control, and of course, BlueFletch Enterprise provides all those things. I would also recommend before jumping into Intune to really evaluate your business's requirements. So what are you doing that's kind of non-standard as far as Android Enterprise protocols? Are you pushing files, certificates? Are you setting applications as the default home screen? There's a lot of just security requirements and operational requirements that you pick up and build over time to make your devices function exactly how you want. So really evaluate that list and think about where some of your biggest gaps and concerns might be. And reach out if you want to chat through any of those, and we can see how we can best solve those. But again, if you're using a combination of Intune and OEM config, you might have a path to solve that. Lastly, Microsoft, as I showed in that Gartner quadrant earlier, is really investing and growing this Android part of their business a lot. They're actively adding to the Intune platform. And one of the things I really like about it is they're transparent with their roadmap. If you go to their Endpoint Manager site and look at their roadmap, they have things broken out by platform, including Android. And interestingly enough, I saw today that one of their roadmap items was actually adding IP address reporting for Android enterprise devices, which is that little blurb we saw a few slides back, which is missing right now. But yeah, they are investing, and more companies will be making this jump, or at least considering Intune in the future. That's a quick little interest over time graph in the bottom from Google over the last 5 years. I'm looking at Microsoft Intune. You can see there's a pretty steady increase until almost the last year. It's jumped a lot, and I think that's going to just continue as Microsoft, continues to be competitive with cost and with functionality, and continues to add more and more features. So that's all I have for you today. There were a couple questions I wanted to get to that were pre-submitted before this recording. So I'm going to go ahead and answer those now. But if you do have any other questions, please reach out to me or to our team. My contact info is here on the screen. And there's more information at our website of how we can best supplement Intune, including a blog post by myself that was done last month. So the first question, AirWatch is a little expensive and complicated for us. Is Intune less so? Well, yeah, it is less expensive, but I wouldn't say it's less complicated. AirWatch does a lot of Android enterprise functionality as well, but they've also built a lot of mechanisms on top for managing those devices. And they have a pretty good UI for organizing and structuring devices. I would say Intune might actually even be a little more complicated because there is such deep integrations with Azure AD and other Microsoft tools that you also have to be familiar with those tools to be a power user in Intune. Can Intune perform single sign-on, or is that only Active Directory? So Intune's single sign-on for shared devices is through their manage home screen. And as of now, that can only be pointed to the same Azure Active Directory organization that your Intune environment lives. So that's okay if you are set up with Azure AD, but a lot of companies out there are using Okta as their identity provider, Ping, Google Workspace. That is not currently supported by Intune. So it's not, I wouldn't call it a true single sign-on because it's really just limited to Teams right now. And it's through through Azure AD. Can Intune Microsoft Launcher work as a device kiosk, or is there something better? So yes, you can use the manage home screen as a kiosk mode and only provide access to one or a few applications. From my reading, it seems like people think it's a little bit hard to configure. So there are other options out there. A lot of the OEMs will provide you one either free or for low cost. And these are just lockdown launchers for blocking access to security, but only providing access to certain applications. So yeah, there's those from your OEMs, as well as BlueFletch's launcher can act as just a kiosk mode as well, and doesn't need to be a full single sign-on shared device setup. Lastly, do you have to use BlueFletch with Intune? So no, as I mentioned, BlueFletch Enterprise is built to be completely standalone and agnostic. We can deploy it standalone. We can deploy it through Workspace ONE, through Intune, through SODI, 42 Gears, etc. Take it or leave it. Any of our modules can be dropped in. So if you want just our support and our analytics, you can drop in that tool. If you want just single sign-on, we need just the launcher. So we designed this to be very modular and really completely agnostic across any Android device. Well, that's all I have for you today. Again, please reach out if you have any questions. There's also a blog post on our website that goes into a bit more detail. But, keep tuned into this channel. We're going to have more webinars in the future for more interesting topics. I know I'll hear more and more about Intune in the next few years, and I'm excited to continue learning. So thanks everyone for joining, and I hope you have a wonderful day.